Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Dr. Bogosian's Intro to Philosophy class. I hope you had a great time during the first week of class and during the first module as we jumped into talking about the questions related to what is philosophy and what is the nature of truth and how do we know truth about the world outside of ourselves, outside of our minds, as well as truth about ourselves. Is truth known solely through kind of subjective feelings and preferences and perceptions? Or is it only known relative to some set of cultural agreements? Or is truth objective? Is it when a proposition that we hold to be true actually has evidence that indicates it matches up to the world outside of or independent of what we happen to think or what any group happens to think about it? As we suggested last week, the dominant view in the history of philosophy is the one expressed by Daniel Dennett in his paper, that truth is objective. It's when a proposition or a claim corresponds to or matches up to the way the mind-independent world is. Yes, we do have perceptions of that world. The world appears to us a certain way. It strikes us a certain way. But at the end of the day, that's not where the buck stops, right? Those claims can be known to be true or false, and they're known to be true or false in light of supporting good evidence. And so we suggested to you that philosophy is the pursuit of wisdom, and wisdom requires knowledge of the truth, and truth needs to be real. It needs to be real independent of what I or you or any group happens to think about it. That's really important to the question we're going to begin pursuing in this next module, which is often called the God question, or it's a question in philosophy related to metaphysics. Metaphysics is about what is real, what is ultimate, what is reality made up of? And we mean that in a real broad general sense, okay? What's included or should be included in reality? Is it purely physical, natural phenomena? Or as Rosenberg was debating with Williamson last week, are there non-natural realities, okay? Non-natural doesn't necessarily mean supernatural. Non-natural could be like numbers, colors, relations, like to the right of, to the left of. Maybe those are abstract, universal, non-natural realities that exist, and they happen to make their way into our world in ways that we can perceive them, but they're not physical, right? They're not made of matter. There's some other kind of non-natural thing. Now the next question is, let's suppose there are non-natural realities in addition to natural phenomena, realities. Are there supernatural entities or supranatural, that is beyond the natural in a special kind of way? That could be personalities, beings that, or a being, right? And this would open the door to questions related to the human self or soul being non-physical, whether or not there are other beings that are, let's say, supernatural, like angels and demons and God or the devil, or depending on what your worldview might include, witches and this sort of stuff, right? So these are all important questions. We're going to focus on one very important one that's been very influential in the history of humankind, especially, but in the West in particular, but also in the East. And that is that reality includes some kind of deity or deities. Greek philosophy, right, is friendly to polytheism in the philosophy of Plato and others. And that shows up in certain religions, especially out of the East, like Hinduism and others. But in the West here, we have what are called the Western monotheisms, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And generally, they all agree, again, that God is one. There's one supernatural being that's ultimate, at least, and that being carries an honorific title. And last lecture, we got going on one reason to believe that God exists, and that was the Kalam cosmological argument. Today, what we're going to look at is one more argument that theists, whether they, of any of the monotheistic varieties, they could leverage, let's say, to say that, God exists, and God at a minimum is all-powerful, all-knowing, acts for reasons, has free will, is morally perfect and worthy of worship, right? That's at a minimum what we're interested in. Now, the particularities of what that being looks like or is like is going to vary among the monotheisms, but they agree on that much. And so the Kalam last time we said that Craig defended, and that you hear him defend in the debate with Stephen Law. That was actually original with Muslim philosophers. He's breathed, even though he's a Christian, Craig is a Christian, he's breathed new life into it over the last 25 to 30 years. And there are many Christians as well as Jewish philosophers that would be sympathetic to that argument. Today, we're going to look at another one called the design argument, and the fine-tuning argument, or the watchmaker argument. Okay, they're all in the same neighborhood of what's called an argument from design. And we're going to look at two kinds of design arguments, and there are more than two. The classic design argument is a watchmaker-style design argument. So we'll start with William Paley's version, look at how Hume criticizes it, and then we're going to move into looking at a contemporary version called the fine-tuning argument. And the fine-tuning argument is kind of where the state of play is on contemporary design arguments. You'll notice that these are also arguments about the cosmos, cosmological arguments. But instead of asking the question, like the Kalam asked, why is there something rather than nothing at all? Design arguments are seeking an answer to the question, why is there this particular kind of universe, a universe that permits and sustains life of any kind, but especially human life forms? And that's really important. It looks like everything is well designed to permit and sustain life. Everything is dialed in or finely tuned. It's locked in perfectly just to permit, right, allow for plant life, ocean life, human life, and so on, as well as to sustain it, right, in something like we call an ecosystem. So let's get going here. I'm going to pull up my screen. And again, you want to make sure to hop on over to the Canvas modules to pull up the note sheet that goes along with this, just like last time. All right, so William Paley, right? He's a theistic philosopher. He's trying to convince non-theists, like maybe some of you, that God exists and there are rational reasons to believe in God. We can't start with the Quran or the Bible because that would be circular. We have to start with text-independent reasons, right? Sacred text-independent reasons to believe that God exists. And that gives us rational evidence to indicate that the claim God exists is more likely to be true than the claim that God doesn't exist. And in the next lecture, we're going to look at arguments against God's existence from the problem of evil. But here we go. William Paley's watchmaker argument, let me pull this down and get it out of the way here, is pretty simple and straightforward. And you've probably heard some version of this from people that maybe you know, or maybe things that you have debated or discussed online yourself. And William Paley basically says, look, let's imagine you're walking along this beautiful beach in my background, and you find a watch. If you want to update the example to make it more kind of current, you might say, well, let's imagine you find a smartphone, right? It turns out that I just had to replace my iPhone 6, was dying on me. So I got a newer iPhone SE. So that's all I need to meet my purposes. But let's suppose I found one of these down at Huntington Beach while I'm walking around, and I push the home button, right? And it powers up, and then I look at all these icons, for these apps, and I start pushing them, and I push the little, and it does things, right? It pulls up information, and it makes a phone call, et cetera, et cetera. Now let's imagine I ask myself, dude, what explains this device that it pushes these buttons? It has these buttons, and when I push them, it does certain things. Well, it would be a natural inference and a legitimate inference to go, well, this looks to be purposeful, right? It exhibits purpose, right? These icons are here for a purpose. These buttons are here for a purpose. Let's suppose I dig a little deeper. I'm really the inquisitive type, and I'm an engineering-minded type, and so I pry open the device. I have a little, let's say screwdriver, and I pop open the screen, and I start looking around at all the internal parts, and I go, man, that's phenomenal. How does this all work together to enable me to get on the internet and make a phone call and so on? Well, it would be a legitimate inference, right, to infer that this is the product of an intentional action or set of actions on the behalf of a mind of some kind or other, or a group of minds, right, that plan, intend, set out to put this stuff together to create it for a set of purposes or ends or goals, right? Like making calls and accessing information and so on. And now, if I look out at the vast, beautiful ocean in the landscape, and now I compare that to this phone I've just found or this watch, I would draw a comparison and say, well, look, man, we've got waves coming in and the sun comes up and goes down, and there's just this ebb and flow that makes sense. It's purposeful. It gives life to the ocean life, and you know, things work just as they should. Well, the universe is like this smartphone, this device. How will it exhibit purpose and design? Well, if this exhibits purpose and design and therefore implies intelligence, explains its existence, well, then the ocean and the landscape with its exhibiting purpose and design also implies the process, the result of being the product of intelligence or a mind. Now, this is an inductive argument, not deductive, so the conclusion is probabilistic. That means it's highly likely, given that the comparisons are tight, right, that anything that exhibits design and creativity and purpose implies intelligence explaining it. Therefore, another thing that exhibits design and intelligence and purpose is likely to be the product of intelligence as well. Therefore, the universe is the product of intelligence or a mind. It's the result of a designing mind or intelligence, and that designer is going to be God. So the second stage of the argument basically goes like this: the universe is larger and more complex. Yes, this smartphone is amazing, right? They get better, and they get you get more data and more faster and better cameras, right? But the universe is even more intricate. It has more moving parts that work together just so. And so since it's vastly larger and more complex than any human artifact, including the iPhone 11, let's say, or the maybe you have a Samsung Galaxy, well, then the universe has to be the product of a more vast mind. And I know that might be hard for some to imagine, given how smart the people are in the Silicon Valley and how smart maybe some of you are, or how intelligent the engineers at Google are, and so on, Samsung. And so, but if you take this into account, right, he's moving from artifacts to the whole universe. And if artifacts exhibit design and purpose and intelligence and imply mind that caused them or brought them about, then the whole universe implies the same thing. Now, Paley's contemporary, David Hume, the famous Scottish skeptic, was skeptical of this argument of theism in general, but he didn't think that this argument was successful. And he has a series of criticisms that are actually reused, if you will, or repackaged in contemporary times by people like our Four Horsemen. Dawkins leverages some of them in The God Delusion, and Dennett in his book Breaking the Spell. And Christopher Hitchens, if you watch the debate with him and Craig that you can find on YouTube, he does the same thing. And so David Hume goes after the analogy, and that's how you, just for what it's worth to you, anytime someone is making an analogy, the way you critique an analogy, you do critical thinking on it, is to go after how the two things are being compared are not alike. Okay, excuse me. How the two things being compared are actually dissimilar or disanalogous. And so David Hume does that. And his first criticism says this, that this argument commits the two fallacies of informal fallacies of logic. Number one, called the fallacy of composition. The fallacy of composition is the composition that argues that what's true of the parts of something is not true of the whole thing. So if something might be true of the parts, but not true of the whole thing. And then the other criticism is weak analogy. Let's stay on composition for a minute. Let's suppose I said, okay, so he's going to argue that what's true of the parts of the universe is not true of the whole universe. David Hume, let me give you an example now, come back to the universe. Let's suppose I said to you, well, look, let's suppose we worked at the morgue together, to use a little bit of a morbid example. I was watching a cop show last night, which is why this is on my mind. Okay, let's imagine at the morgue, they end up having to, part out the cadaver because they're going to donate their body parts to science. And let's say they weigh one arm and it weighs 5 pounds, and they weigh another arm and it weighs 5 pounds, and they now write on the death certificate that the victim weighs 5 pounds. Well, that's a clear fallacy of composition, because what's true of the parts right? That an arm weighs 5 pounds, the other arm weighs 5 pounds, therefore the cadaver weighs 5 pounds. That's going to be false, right? Because the whole thing is going to weigh more than the individual parts. David Hume is making that sort of criticism of the design of Paley's design argument by saying, look, it might be true that the parts of the universe are designed. Maybe the human eye is designed to see, or the human heart is designed to pump blood through a circulatory system. But it doesn't follow from that the entire universe is designed. Maybe design accidentally arises along the way. Okay, I'm giving you an example in light of contemporary evolutionary theory. Maybe evolution somehow births design, right, accidentally along the way, given enough time, right, and chance and variation. So David Hume is making an important argumentative move. He doesn't really think parts of the universe are designed, but he thinks it's possible, right, that parts of some artifact are designed, but not the whole thing. Now, I'll leave it to you to decide whether that's a plausible criticism, because most people would say of artifacts, it's highly unlikely that the parts are designed, but the whole thing just kind of came together by accident, right? It's undesigned, right? It self-assembles or something, but maybe that's possible. He also says, look, now this is the fallacy of weak analogy. The universe being compared with artifacts like a watch is a weak analogy. Why? Well, because they're not exactly similar. Now, that's a little too strong because no analogy is exactly similar, because then you'd have the same thing, right? But the stronger the things are alike, the more they're alike, the better the analogy, and the more likely the conclusion follows. David Hume thinks it's worse than that, though, right? He thinks the watch and the universe are dissimilar. Well, why? Well, because we only have, here we go, one universe. This is the second objection, called this the only universe objection. We have lots of examples of objects like this, right? We have lots of examples of watches that we can now get a sample set, right, that's big and diverse, and we can realize that watches typically are the product of intelligence. Smartphones are typically the product of an intelligence or a group of minds, right? But if you only have a small, limited sample set that's one unit, right, a universe that's the only one that we know of. Of course, we can speculate a multiverse, but we can't go survey them. If we could, well, then Hume is open to, well, maybe it's possible that universes are designed, or at least some are designed. And then we'd have to explain how that we have that disparity. But since we only have one universe to go on, we can't justifiably infer that universes are the product of an intelligent cause, right? A designing creative intelligence, like we can with artifacts. And so there's no reason that we have to believe that this isn't good enough reason, this design argument, to believe that the universe is the product of a supernatural creative intelligence. Now, Paley, being a good philosopher in his day, anticipated this objection and was aware of it and tried to respond to it. So here's his response. He said, well, look, more than one example actually isn't necessary to infer design from an artifact or anything. Now get this. Let's imagine, I know this is hard for us to imagine in 2020, but let's imagine whatever, going on 20 years ago or whatever it is now, 16 years ago, when the so-called smartphone was about to come out. And they hadn't really burst onto the market in whatever, around 2000 and whatever that was, early 2000s, 2004-ish maybe. Okay, and let's imagine we all still have the little flip phones or whatever. We had candy bar phones that didn't do any of what these things do. And Apple has the prototype for the original iPhone, okay? And what happens is somebody working on that prototype leaves the prototype somewhere out and about when they're doing their errands. And you happen to find that prototype. And there's only one. They lost it. They screwed up, right? Now, let's suppose you get all curious and you start pushing buttons and you don't know what this thing is called, but you look down there and you see a little, here, let me open mine up. You see that little phone icon, right? Oops, let's see, can I get it there? There it is, you know, the little phone icon. And you make a legitimate inference, huh, that looks like a phone. Let me press that. Okay. And then you get this, right, with all the numbers. And you go, oh, look, I wonder, those are numbers. I wonder if I can dial. I know what a number is with a connected phone. And so you go through the process, and lo and behold, you can dial your home number, your boyfriend or girlfriend's number. Well, if you make an inference, right, that this is a product of intelligence, that would be a legitimate rational inference, even if there's one and only one sample, right? It doesn't follow that this isn't the product of intelligence. No, that's at least equally plausible, maybe more plausible. So Paley's response is, we could do that with the universe too. The fact that we don't have lots of universes to compare and contrast it with doesn't mean that it can't be the product of a mind. Far from it. We can do this all the time with things like prototypes, especially with new technology, new anything that's being new and design, the product of intelligence. Now, Hume has a pushback. His third criticism is its monotheism doesn't follow from the argument, right? There's no reason to think that the universe is the design of one God, a single designing agent, right? Supernatural being. Because for all we know, right, there could have been a panel of gods. Polytheism could be true, right? Maybe it took a group of gods to make this thing happen, just like it takes a group of people to make bring about a smartphone or sometimes a watch, right? You have to have multiple engineers or multiple experts working on something to piece it together, to create the parts to put it together. Now William Paley has a response to this. And this is Occam's razor. Occam's razor came up in the first lecture on the Kalam, but let's review. Occam's razor is a scientific principle, an explanatory principle that comes from William of Occam. And the idea here is that we should prefer simple explanations over complex ones when the simpler explanation has all the explanatory power that we need to adequately and fully account for the phenomenon in question. All right, the phenomenon in question is the apparent design of the universe, it being purposeful, woven together for a purpose, for everything to work just so. Is that adequately explained by a single supernatural mind of sufficient power and intentionality and will and creativity? Yes. The more you add supernatural entities to it, it just convolutes the picture, right? It bloats the ontology or the metaphysics, as we say. It multiplies entities beyond what's necessary. And so Paley is saying we can pull out the proverbial razor and shave away those unneeded explanatory entities. Now, oftentimes non-theists today, you will hear them say, like Dawkins, well, why don't you all I'm doing is shaving away one more entity. Well, Paley is going to respond to that. Well, the reason you can't do that is naturalism by itself cannot adequately account for design, right? Because all you're left with is something like chance and accident, right? If you take mind and intentionality and purposiveness, that's all connected to something like consciousness, minds, right? Agencies. But if you take agencies and mind and consciousness out of the picture, what you're left with are particles and energy, and those aren't intentional, right? They don't do things for purpose. They don't have that sort of capacity and power, right? So you can't, on Paley's view at least, you can't use the razor just to further shave away God. God is a better explanation of design, the design of the universe, than naturalism. Now, the fourth criticism of David Hume is called sort of the poor designer argument. And I'm going to say something just briefly today. I'll say more in the next lecture about Stephen Law's evil God argument. That's not this here. That's a different argument. And it's an interesting one. And some of you have already commented about it to me in email. You're asking good questions about it. Keep that up, by the way. Some of you are commenting about it in the discussion board. So you need to get clear on Law's argument. It's unique to him and interesting, and it's not this. Okay, David Hume here is saying, he's kind of granting Paley, okay, so what? Let's suppose God designed there's a God and he designed the universe. What's up with the parts of the universe that seem to be less than optimally designed? They're not well designed. In fact, they're poorly designed. The rods and cones in the human eye, for example, it's been said, are not well designed. This is how we end up with all sorts of eye conditions. that we're aware of, and you end up having to get LASIK eye surgery, you have to get cataracts removed, or you don't see well and you need glasses. What about the appendix? Are they necessary? Maybe not. Okay, so on and so forth. These are examples just in the human system, and we could go on, right? Where it seems like the designer, if this God is all powerful and all good, would want to design good things to flourish, hasn't done that, right? What you start hearing here is the remnants of an argument from evil, right? If God has done a bad job, well, then that's an indictment on God, right? He's dropped the ball, the divine ball, so to speak, and hasn't, acted in such a way that's exemplary of divine agency, right, and divine activity. And so either what you have here is God doing a poor job, and that calls the nature of God into question. He's not worship worthy. He's not a good being. Or this serves as a defeater for God's existence, because an evil God would be no God at all, or a subpar God would be a God not worthy of worship. And who would want to follow such a being? Why trust such a God with your life, right, if he can't get the job done in a good way? Now, this is Daniel Dennett from Breaking the Spell. He uses this criticism. He says, what surprise we must entertain when we find God, him, a stupid mechanic, right, who imitated others, copied an art, which through a long succession of ages, after multiplied trials and mistakes, corrections, deliberations, and controversies, has been gradually improving. What he's getting at here is a couple things. Number one is it looks like God keeps creating, right, keeps updating 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, because it's like he can't get it right. And he's just sort of ripping other cell phone companies off, if you will, other creators off. And it's like he's struggling, right, to perfect things, number one. The other thing he's going for here is there are theists who are called theistic evolutionists, and we'll get to that a little bit later, who don't think you have to pick between God and creation like Dawkins thinks you do, or God and evolution. If evolution, right, is true, such people say, then God has to guide the process. Well, then it is pressing on that and saying, well, evolution is a horrific process, full of death and dying, and we get killed off or die off, and then you get new versions and improved species, or the weak species die off. That's unbecoming of a good, all-powerful being that's supposedly creating for reasons. Now, Paley hasn't responded to this. He says, well, okay, Paley doesn't think God's done a poor job. But he says, even if God's done a poor job, that doesn't imply that he isn't the designer. In fact, that grants the point. Now, maybe what we need is more in the debate. The debate is moving on from, does God explain design? And it sounds like Hume is actually saying yes, implicitly. Now the question becomes one of, does William Paley and the theists have resources in their philosophy and theology to account for what looks to be like suboptimal design? Did God really do that? Or are there other things that explain what's gone wrong? And Paley thinks there are other things that explain what have gone wrong. For example, when we get into the problem of evil next time, one thing someone like Paley will have to say is, it's not God that's suboptimal. God designed things and made them perfect. But what happens if I drop my phone? Is that Apple's fault that the screen shatters, that it's not optimally designed? Or is that a mismanagement, a mishandling of the owner? Well, it's a mishandling of the owner, even though you might argue, well, it shouldn't be made of glass. Well, okay, but that allows me to have a nice touch screen, right? So at least at the present time, we don't have the materials that are unbreakable that help it function the way it needs to function. Well, maybe the world's the same way. Maybe if God has made human systems a certain way, but then humans have made bad choices, right? Maybe that has a retroactive, had a negative effect on us, right, over the long term. And some theologies call this sin or defect or disillusionment, right, or disobedience, lack of submission, right, in Islam to God's will. Okay, all of those have a way of messing up or bringing defect into the design, a perfect design process. And that's because God isn't mechanically just engineering things in a deterministic way. Now, of course, there are theologies that are deterministic, But some like Paley, he's not a determinist, so he wants to hold that, there are other ways to explain what looks to be on the surface less than good design, but that's actually not God's fault, so to speak. God has allowed other agencies like us to make choices that have adverse effect on design. In fact, what's going on with, let's say, our planet right now, it would be explained the same way. But let's keep going. Hume, interestingly enough, towards the end of his life, some believe, although there's some debate among Hume scholars on how to read him, he may have moved towards agnosticism or closer to theism by the time he died, even though he, in his criticisms of the design argument, seems, and much of his career and life, seemed to be pretty clearly an atheist. He says this in one of his writings later on: no man can deny the analogies between the effects. That is, you can't deny the analogy of the design of the universe with an artifact that looks to be designed with their effects, right? Right? The analogies are as good as their effects. The effects being that they function for purposes, and purposes imply creativity and mind, and therefore they're intelligently caused, let's say. To restrain ourselves from inquiring concerning the causes is scarcely possible. It's a very natural thing to want to go, well, what caused this? What brought about this photo? What brought about this universe? From this inquiry, the legitimate conclusion is that the causes have also an analogy. If the effects are analogous, right, then the causes are analogous. If we are not contented with calling the first and supreme cause a God or deity, but desire to vary the expression, we at least have to call what explains the universe, right, is what he's talking about, mind or thought, to which he is justly supposed to bear considerable resemblance to the mind and thought that brings about artifacts like phones or watches or what have you. I'm going to give you a couple minutes. I'm going to pause and let you think about this. Now we're going to shift into talking about the second kind of argument for the last 10 minutes or so. And I want you to think about what exactly is evolution as we talk about it. What is Darwinian evolution? Interestingly enough, even though we're kind of raised to believe in evolution, it's all through the sciences, it's the dominant view among scientists. What exactly does that mean? And I want you to think about that, because I want you to think further. The second question is, how might Darwinian evolution serve to be a counter explanation to what initially looks to be a designed universe? How might evolution supplant the design explanation with an alternate explanation? How does that alternate explanation go? Take about a minute, and then we'll come back and we'll look at the next part of the lecture. Okay, let's put it this way. Richard Dawkins and others have argued that design is only apparent. That is, at first look, right, at the surface level, sure, the universe looks to be designed. But in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, right, Selfish Gene, and other works of his like this, he argues that design is only apparent, it's not real. And that's because Darwinian evolution is a powerful has an explanatory framework that should give us pause before we attribute design to natural phenomena. Well, why is that? Well, because remember, in Darwinian evolution, we have chance, time, variation, natural selection, which is the key here. Natural selection is where nature selects for organisms what that organism or species needs to survive. So think of the Galapagos finches and their beaks growing, extending in order so they get the food and they survive. Or why are we bipeds? Well, why do we have eyes? Well, we have eyes so that if we just were bipeds and we walked around, we couldn't see, well, we would pretty quickly die off. And so eyes are advantageous. Nature selects eyesight for us so that we survive and aren't quickly killed off. So you have chance, you have variation, you have time, you have natural selection, right, is kind of the mechanism that is operating on all of the evolution, all of these natural processes to help natural phenomena in organisms develop what is needed, let's say, in order to survive and thrive. And natural selection then, of course, weeds out, so to speak, kills off the weaker within a species or the weaker species. And then that turns to be good for everyone. Now, notice what happened there. There was no, and I intentionally use the word mechanical, there's no, needs to be no reference to intelligence. And that's just as the way it should be, according not only to Darwin, but Dawkins and others. So what we have here is if we take Darwinian evolution and naturalism combined and make that explanation number one, and then you have the design explanation. What explains apparent design? Well, you have intelligence, right? Intelligent causation, let's say, creative intelligence. Those are competing explanations for what we look around and see as a universe kind of dialed in to have an ecosystem that works just as it needs to. Which one is the better explanation? That's what we're going to ask now. We're no longer doing an analogy to artifacts. The fine-tuning argument of today, the contemporary design argument, is called the fine-tuning argument. And if you're interested in reading, I believe I linked to this in the Canvas. If you're interested in it, I will send you Robin Collins, a link to Robin Collins' paper. He's one of the foremost defenders of fine-tuning. A lot of others. Craig has a fine-tuning kind of argument in the debate with him and Stephen Law. But if you want to read this, people who are real into science and math like this, tend to like this argument, even if they don't agree with it, because it's a lot of that. But Robin Collins gives you that, plus he gives you some trimmed down explanation. He does philosophy of science. He's a theist. And basically what he argues is that, he argues that we should think of the cosmos like, metaphorically, like having dials, right? Like dials on an old school lock that you turn or something, where you have to lock, you have to get the left, right, left, and the numbers exactly right on the hash mark in order to open that lock. You have to dial things in perfectly, lock them in for the universe to permit and sustain life. Now the question is, how do the dials get set in the first place so that the universe is finely tuned to have what are called cosmological constants like gravity and the gravitational pull and everything to be just so? Because if one of the cosmic dials, right, these constants were a small fraction different, either the universe would suffer a heat death, it would burn out and kill off all living things, or it would be too cold and freeze everything to death. But neither of those extremes have happened or are happening. And so the question is, how is that the case, that the universe appears to be finely tuned, dialed in perfectly to permit and sustain human life? Well, you have two explanations and only two. One is the Darwinian evolutionary explanation, that you can explain it purely in naturalistic terms, invoking evolutionary processes and natural selection, or it's going to be the designing intelligence of a sufficiently powerful creative mind that acts for reasons and sets the dials. Collins in his paper argues that Darwinian evolution with natural selection can't adequately explain it. And we're going to look at that argument here now. So here we go. The basic argument goes this way. Specific parts of the universe are incredibly detailed and serve specific purpose, and the whole universe is arranged or dialed in just right for there to be life of any kind. Plant life, ocean life, human life. The fine-tuning is best explained by an uncaused, intelligent designer, okay, intelligent mind. And fine-tuning is not improbable, right? It's not improbable or unlikely if theism is true, if God exists, in other words, but is very unlikely or improbable if the atheistic single universe hypothesis is true. The atheistic single universe is that we have one universe where there's no God, and all we have for explanatory categories are naturalism and natural selection and evolution. All right, let's look at the, notice this isn't what's called this is called a best explanation argument. Inference to the best explanation is an inductive argument form that happens all the time in the sciences. And what happens is you have a phenomena, and then you are trying to explain that phenomenon, so you set up different explanations to explain the phenomena. Detectives do this all the time. The court system works this way. Hey, here's what happened. Who's guilty? What explains the event, right? So our phenomena here is the fine-tuning of the universe. Now, our explanations, if you want to draw them in two circles on your page, would be the theism, right? That a designing supernatural designer God has finely tuned the universe, or hypothesis 2, atheist single universe hypothesis, which is naturalism, natural selection, evolution, no God, and it's a causally closed system. There's no interference from the outside. Okay, here we go. Collins says what scientists use is a principle, right? When they're trying to explain a phenomenon, it's called the prime principle of confirmation. That is, you set out your possible hypothesis to explain the phenomena, and a hypothesis has something going for it. It increases in likelihood as the best explanation if it confirms, right? It's confirmed by what you observe, right? An observation counts as evidence in favor of a hypothesis under which that observation has the highest likelihood or is least improbable. Okay. So take our two hypotheses, the God hypothesis or the atheist single universe hypothesis. If we observe something in the natural world, and that will count in evidence for one of those hypotheses, if it's more likely on that hypothesis, and it'll count against the hypothesis if it's less than likely, right? Or more improbable, okay? So for example, how do we get mind at all? Well, Robin Collins thinks mind, thought, creativity, consciousness is going to be best explained. That observing that generally is more explicable in a universe where what's ultimate in that universe is a designing intelligence that is uncaused, an uncaused first cause, that is a mind, has a mind, acts for reasons, knows all there is to know, is purposive and creative and so on. But there being, let's say, human mind that supposedly emerges along the way from mindless matter is highly unlikely or improbable. So if we're just talking about human minds, they're better explained on a theistic hypothesis than a non-theistic evolutionary hypothesis. And we'll come back to that when we get into the what are human persons debate. Now let's take the whole universe. Okay. Let's start with an illustration before we mention the whole universe. Let's suppose, again, since you can tell I like the beach, that's a happy place for me. I wish I could go. And this whole shutdown sort of thing with the pandemic has made that impossible, right? But when I get to go again, right, let's imagine I take my family to the beach. And when we arrive there, let's say, I don't know, Huntington Beach or Santa Cruz, we're the first ones there, and we arrive and there's this big engraving in the sand, "Welcome to Santa Cruz, Bogosian family." Now, we have a couple, that's the phenomena, okay? And we go, whoa, this is amazing. What is up with this? Our name is in the sand, and it's this happy, feel-good message welcoming us here. What explains that? And I guarantee at least our 6-year-old son would be very curious about that, as would my wife and I. Now, we got a couple possibilities, right? Some mind or group of minds intended that and made those inscriptions in the sand. Somehow knew we were going to be there and decided to welcome us. People at the hotel we're staying at, or family members who snuck down there, we didn't know it, and they're playing a joke on us. Okay, but some mind or other, or group of minds, intended it. Okay, so we get the mind hypothesis. Or hypothesis number 2 is a purely naturalistic one, right? Where, well, you know, there was high tide and heavy winds last night, and things got blown around, and there's a welcome message on the beach. Now, if we take those two as our exclusive options to explain the welcome message, which has more going for it? Well, an observation of a meaningful message to us inscripted in a sandy beach, and there's no one else around that we can see. A hypothesis that's a mind hypothesis has more going for it than a non-mind hypothesis, right? Because what we know of writing meaningful messages typically is the result of a mind. Or if it's a computer, right? It's been programmed to type or write or spit out the meaningful message. And so it's a greater likelihood that this is a product of an intelligence of some sort or group of intelligences than it's the product of blind chance, accident, where there's no mind involved. By analogy, okay, now back to the universe, by analogy, if you take the initial conditions of the universe, what in the fundamental laws of physics like gravity and so on, what needs to be the case to dial in a universe that's ours, right, that permits and sustains life of any kind and doesn't freeze it out or burn it out. What is needed is something so improbable on naturalism, right, where for a purely naturalistic, unintended, non-mental, non-conscious kind of explanation to be have caused this universe, designed it, is like if you took the whole universe and drew a big dartboard, right, and you fill it with the entire galaxy with a dartboard, and the conditions necessary for life are like a 1 foot size wide target, so that's about a foot wide, right, size target in the entire galaxy, right? Now, what is the likelihood that someone could throw a dart into the galaxy and hit that 1 foot size dartboard by chance, accidentally? Well, incredibly low, right? And he gives you the math in his paper. That's what it would be like for a purely naturalistic set of causes, right? Evolution and natural selection to dial in a universe. In fact, what's more is evolutionary processes require there to be a finely tuned universe because those are, ordered processes, you might say, in some way. So they can't self-explain. And Dawkins likes to say, well, look, natural selection should give us pause before we attribute design. Well, Collins says back, well, natural selection is not self-explanatory. We need to explain how it is that natural selection does anything. And for what it's worth, Robin Collins is a theistic evolutionist. He accepts evolution and natural selection up to a point. But he says, look, natural selection can't explain natural selection, and it can't explain how we have a universe that permits evolutionary processes to do what they do. Instead, what you need mentality that's of sufficient power and ingenuity and creativity to bring about a universe and dials it in that allows even, let's say, a single cell to get the whole thing going, right? And what's more than that, our universe, right, couldn't be, let's not say could be, it's highly unlikely that it's just one among many universes, right? So the multiverse people like Stephen Hawking come in here and say, well, maybe our universe is only one that happens to be the finely tuned one, but there are hundreds or thousands of others that are not finely tuned. They're just accidental chance, right? Maybe there's a universe generating machine just spitting out universes en masse, and it's a luck of the draw that we have one that permits and sustains human life that's finely tuned. Well, there are a couple replies from Collins. Number one, there didn't have to be a life-permitting, life-sustaining universe, right? Its existence is more naturally explained by an intelligent mind than a universe-generating machine. By analogy, if we wanted to ask how it is that we had T-Rexes at one point, right, that roamed the planet, dinosaurs, we've been reading about dinosaurs with our son. Well, we could explain it by there being a dinosaur bone-generating machine. That's how we got dinosaurs. Or we could say, hey, there was something that intelligently brought it about, or an ordered process, call it evolution even. But then we're back to what explains the evolutionary processes that bring about dinosaurs, right? And so mind has more explanatory power than a universe-generating machine that's happening at random. What's more is you would have to still now, the debate just gets moved back a step by positing a universe-generating machine, right? That becomes an organized thing that needs accounting for. So either now we're back to a naturalistic thing that explains that, or a supernaturalistic explanation. And Collins is saying, look, a mind is going to better explain a universe-generating machine. But what really is going on here is to make the universe generating machine multiverse move, which we have no scientific evidence for, it's really just a speculative, highly metaphysically speculative move in physics, you have to pay a high intellectual price to actually believe that, to get around the design argument, Collins says. You have to believe in many universes, which we have no evidence of their existence, and you have to believe in this machine. And that, again, is to blow up your worldview when there's no evidence to support it, and that's a real high intellectual price to pay. And usually rational people don't want to allow for that sort of thing just to maneuver around an argument, says Collins. His third reply is that there really is more beauty and elegance to the fundamental laws of nature, or excuse me, their beauty and elegance is better explained by theism than the single universe atheist hypothesis. How? Well, things like beauty and elegance and creativity are the explanations of minds, right? They're always seen to be better explained. If you have a beautiful piece of art or a beautiful piece of music, an elegant outfit, right? It's the product of a designer, somebody who's put it together and thought it up and then put it together. And the same is true for the universe with its fundamental laws that are elegant and beautiful. And scientists regularly use that language, says Collins, to describe them. Physicist Paul Davies says it this way: if nature is so clever as to exploit mechanisms that amaze us with their ingenuity, is that not persuasive evidence of the existence of an intelligent design behind the universe? If the world's finest minds can unravel only with difficulty the deeper workings of nature, how could it be supposed that these workings are merely a mindless accident, a product of blind chance? So to close this off for today, let's ask this question. Well, at this stage of the debate, usually people like Dawkins and Dennett will say, okay, well, fine. If the beauty and elegance and fine-tuning the universe is best explained by designing God, who explains the designer? And that's a fair question. In fact, many atheists like George Smith say, well, look, if you explain the design of the universe with God, well, then God, who is more wonderful, more beautiful, and more complex, needs a designing explanation. Well, reply number one is, even if God is more complex than the universe, it doesn't follow, right, that God isn't the explanation. It just requires, that the theist account for God's complexity, okay? So God could be, in other words, the explanation of the universe, and God could be complex, but now the burden is just on the atheist, the theist, to explain God's nature. And even if theists can't explain the complexity, let's suppose they get put up against the wall and they have to say, well, I can't explain it. It boggles the mind. God could still be the most likely explanation for the fine-tuning of the universe, even if, let's say, and this wouldn't even have to appeal to mystery, it might just be that theologians haven't got all the tools yet to adequately explain the complexity of the divine nature. And people like Thomas Aquinas and others, and William Lane Craig would say the same thing. Now, reply number two, theists don't typically think that God is a complex organism, right, made up of divine parts. God is a simple, right, he's not composed of parts. And so God is an undesigned designer, just like in Craig's argument, he's an uncaused first cause. God isn't designed, right? He exists of his own accord. He doesn't come into being. He isn't complex. He's a simple, unified whole. We can conceptually distinguish his love from his will, from his mind, from his compassion, from his etc. But that doesn't mean you take all those things and you put them in a bottle and out comes, you shake it up and out comes God, right? God isn't a complex organism. He's a simple whole. So what I want to leave you with for today, since we don't have formal discussion groups, is in the discussion board, I would like you to think about this. Which one of the design arguments do you find more compelling, right? Maybe you like the one Craig gave, maybe you like the Paley style, maybe you find one of them more attractive, but you're not ultimately convinced because you're an agnostic or an atheist. That's fine. Explain that. Why you don't find it compelling, even though you think it's the stronger of the two. Or if you find one convincing, explain why you find it convincing and how do you respond to objections from the non-theistic side. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you back here next time to talk about the problem of evil.